before they do. His own book that he cites within his video and doesn't let people click, maybe for this exact reason, says that violence prevention programs, legislative reforms, and declines in firearm availability may contribute to decreased firearm violence, and that some studies identify an association between increased firearm legislation, including firearm purchase background checks, and lower rates of fatal firearm violence. I originally wanted to talk to Steven Crowder directly about this and be able to cite my sources and talk about some things that I found with his sources that I thought were interesting. But because he hasn't answered me back in 2 weeks, I decided that I would go ahead and talk about this in a video of my own where I'd be able to actually reference some specific things he cites and also get to some counter arguments that I wasn't able to make because he continually railroaded me throughout our discussion.
You said 500,000 to 2 million are defended. There are more than one. The
reason I originally wanted to talk to Steven Crowder, and I guess also that student, and why I entered the crowd, is I have seen his videos in the past, specifically his Change My Mind videos. And what I've seen is him blatantly misuse data in the most dishonest ways imaginable, but he's never called out on this because the students he's debating obviously don't have their facts with them, right? They don't have folders full of data that they're able to use or a binder that they carry around like he does.
I have this here. We usually don't reference this, but it's sources in case someone wants to look at them afterward. But
and so he's never called out on these really, really disingenuous use of numbers. For example, in the topic that I originally wanted to talk to him about, which was illegal immigration, I've seen him continually say that whenever a student will talk to him about we shouldn't build a border wall because the majority of illegal immigration comes from overstayed visas. His response without fail to that is, actually it's not. The majority, it only makes up a proportion less than 50%. The majority actually comes from illegal border crossings. Or he'll say just the rest come from illegal border crossings.
Somebody told me that the reason why is to stop illegal immigration. But the fact is that most illegal immigration is from expired visas.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it just be a simpler way to just keep tabs on people who have visas from overseas and just keep a look at them instead of creating a $5 billion wall that's going to require maintenance?
Yeah.
And that's my...
Well, I appreciate where you're coming from with that. This is where we kind of run into a common issue with often on college campuses. So how confident are you that the majority of illegal immigrants are just overstayed visas?
I'm going to say at least a good 80%.
80% confident or 80% of them on?
80% of them.
80% of them? Yeah.
I'm very confident.
It's 42.
42.
It's 42%, which means less than half.
Okay.
Which means the majority of illegal immigrants are crossing through the border.
I'll put these sources in the bottom because I'm Crowder, I won't link them in the video so you can't click them. I'll put them in the actual description. Illegal immigration accounts across the border accounted for 106,000 illegal immigrants in 2016, in contrast to 700,000 foreigners who came by plane or ship and overstayed their visas during the same time period. So if you look at any of the statistics that people are talking about, the majority come from visas, it's true. And even if the visas make up a proportion less than 50%, they still always make up in all of the data that you can cite a plurality of the number of illegal overstays. So I just wanted to talk to him specifically about that because I knew more about the inaccuracies he'd had since I think he recently did a Change My Mind on the border wall at UTD. But I ended up getting to talk to him on gun control because that's the topic that he called me out of the crowd for. Even though I talked with the student first, I want to first go to what Crowder talked about and look at his sources while we do that, because a lot of his sources contain information that completely counteracts the points that he's making and are easy rebuttals to use against the student. But essentially, I don't think Crowder or his team member who was linking it even took more than a cursory glance at the articles that they were citing, because if they had, they would have realized the mistakes that they were making. First topic that he talked to me about was innocuous enough.
And that is what I saw there. Would you go back and think of anything that maybe you said that may not have been necessarily entirely accurate, that someone as formidable of an opponent as maybe yourself might have called you on?
I mean, the one primary thing that I said that was incorrect was when he said, would you restrict rifles? And my instant go-to was no, because I was just thinking hunting and stuff. But as he rightly pointed out, AR-15s would be a semi-automatic, and I would be in favor of banning those. So maybe like when he asked that question, taking a step back and thinking about it for a moment would have been a good part on mine, and not just kind of being reactionary.
I actually appreciate that you recognize that, because you actually said that there are no mass shootings using rifles.
No, I realized when he pointed out that the AR-15 was classified, I was like, oh yeah, no, the semi-automatic weapons. But
and it's an interesting argument, because yes, the vast majority of crimes are often committed with handguns, right?
Yeah.
And typically,
Crowder goes on to point out, and I'll include the source below, the majority of mass shootings occur with handguns, and the majority of gun violence in general occurs with handguns, followed then by rifles, followed by shotguns. So the arguments that I was making in favor of a handgun buyback still stood, regardless of that argument. And even so, I would also argue, and I will argue later, that buyback of other types of guns outside of handguns is also beneficial. So it really did not intersect with my argument in any way. But let's go on to the second point, which then took up a lot more of the discussion time, which was on mental health background checks and expanding background checks in general.
You guys started off, one of the first things you talked about was that there are no mental background checks.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Right.
Now, if you talk about going into someone's medical history, so in other words, if you want to purchase,
that's what I was talking
purchase
about.
a firearm, they get access to all of your personal and private medical records.
Yes,
that being said, have you ever purchased a firearm?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so you don't know what the form looks like?
No.
Okay,
I mean, like I have
run a
family
quick
who
search and you'll
purchased
see it. It actually asks if you've been adjudicated mentally defective.
Sure, right. And
so there is an official standard bearer of mentally defective, and so I think that if he'd have called, then you could have had a different conversation. You saying it's a sliding scale, that I think psychologists should determine that, not a court of law.
Right, but when we talk about that, like you were saying, that I said psychologists should determine that, I think that they should go into the actual medical records and determine whether or not someone has been showing indicators toward that type of behavior, as opposed to just being tried and convicted of, like, as you said, having like on their legal transcript.
Right.
Okay, so this was one of the points that I had seen in previous videos of Crowder that really irked me, because what Crowder would do is, and he did this exact same thing, or at least tried to with me, where you go ahead and you say, well, I think that we need more screenings and background checks and look at stuff like mental illness more carefully. We need to be able to look at indicators toward violence and be able to like stop people who are giving out those indicators from having access to guns. And without fail, to those students, Crowder will say, have you ever bought a gun? Have you looked at the background check? It already does that. And so what I had done previously when I saw that video was I was like, it already does that? Well, what are all these Democrats out here talking about how we need more gun regulation? Like, what are they even saying if we already do it on the background check? So I went ahead and read on this, and so we'll talk about some of the other aspects of background checks that is being pushed currently that weren't discussed at all within this video. But when he's specifically talking about mental health background checks, what he went ahead and did, and he cited this within his video, was talking about how the current law makes you check whether or not you were adjudicated mentally defective, and that being something that a judge would decide whether or not you would have that put on your legal transcript. And so once I got him to the point where we were talking about screening in a medical sense, he immediately, his only real attack on this, well, actually, no, never mind. He had two attacks on this, one extremely disingenuous attack, but then his main attack on this was when he was discussing the movie Minority Report, or I guess it's also a book.
So, like Minority Report, arresting people, removing their rights before they commit a crime.
No, so not removing their rights
that's
before
what you
they
said.
commit a crime. It's going to be taking away their access to weapons that they can use to kill people, right? Or to commit
Before
these
they've killed
domestic
anybody.
abuse. Well, yeah, because
Before they've committed crimes.
Yeah, because when you're talking about like domestic abuse cases, it's not a crime until it happens, and you want to catch that before it happens. And so you're not going to give somebody who's showing all these indicators for domestic abuse.
So let me ask you. So what you're proposing is looking for indicators that someone might commit a violent crime and removing their access to firearms before they commit it.
Yes.
How is that not Minority Report?
Because in Minority Report, they were arresting people based on like whether or not they would commit a crime, not saying, oh, you can't have a gun if you're going to commit a crime. I think the movie Minority Report would have been very different if they said, oh, you're going to commit a crime here. I'm just like not going to give you an AR-15.
So the reason that this is a really bad argument is that U.S. law and policy already functions in a way in which we seek to stop crime from happening before it does. I mean, I guess in Crowder's mind, we already live in this minority-esque world, or at the very least, we're trying to get to a point where we're able to perfectly predict, as I think the movie was saying, or that in the movie and book was saying that they were able to perfectly predict crime, therefore they arrested people before it happened. We already seek to do that within America, where we try to stop crimes from occurring, and so we pass laws and policies that do that. For example, one law that Crowder was extremely vocal in supporting and advocating for was Trump's Muslim ban.
Into 7 Islamically war-torn lands where these refugees, anywhere else they've been settled, skyrocketing rape, skyrocketing crime. So it was people who have gone to visit, green card holders re-entering the country. Now, was it poorly rolled out? Absolutely. Was it poorly planned? Yeah. Has that been remedied? Yes, but it's also not unconstitutional or unprecedented to include green card holders in a temporary moratorium like this.
Now, what did that law seek to do? It was trying to stop crime from happening before it happened by adding a ban. Now, do I agree with that law? No, but still, it clearly in other areas, Crowder is supporting us doing this, and then in this one, he's simply making the reference because he thinks that it's somehow a good rebuttal, but it's just like blatantly wrong. Or you can also look at stuff like no-fly lists, where you're trying to stop terrorist attacks from happening by stopping certain people from being able to board planes. Or you can look at stuff like even within gun control, the fact that he talks about us not letting people who were adjudicated mentally defective from being able to guns. That, while a very much more reduced measure than I was advocating for, is still some sort of pre-crime apparently within Crowder's mind, where we're stopping people's rights before they happen just because they're showing all these indicators and potentiality for being somebody who's going to commit mass murder. And then you can even look toward people who are under the age of 18 aren't able to purchase firearms. Why? Is it because we're taking away their rights in some kind of a dystopian future and violating their ability to hold these guns sacred to them? No, it's because we think that by stopping people who are under the age of 18 from having the right to own a gun, that we are able to massively decrease the risk of crime and potential harm that's going to come out of that. And you can even look toward, finally, I'll just talk about one more, but again, most of U.S. law and policy functions this way. The fact that fully automatic weapons are heavily regulated within the United States and extremely difficult to gain access to. Now, is this pre-crime? I mean, technically, yes, but it's also extremely beneficial, and most of America sees that as something that we're willing to do and give up within our rights in order to make society overall more cohesive and function better and be able to be more secure. But yeah, so at the end there, Crowder's only real response remaining to the idea that we should have more mental screenings for background checks and look at people with mental health more carefully and look at indicators toward violence more carefully, his only response to that was to finally slip in at the very end when he wasn't going to let me respond anymore, that, oh, well, if you take them away, they're just going to run a cooking show.
Those people who are going to commit murder, if you take away the gun, they decide to run a cooking show. Asked, so something else he asked, how many people... shooting?
And while, sure, I would recognize that violent people will probably continue being violent and might seek other avenues to be violent, I think that making it much more difficult for them to be able to do that is what we should seek to do within law and policy, and thus reducing it and overall benefiting society in a net benefit. Obviously, we can't solve the problem 100%, but then also, let's go to one of our first studies, which is going to be a 2016 study published in the Journal of Epidemiologic Reviews. And again, links included below because I'm not going to disingenuously include them in the bottom of the video where you can't click them. And so basically this was a meta-analysis that was conducted across 130 different studies spanning 10 different countries. And what this meta-analysis found is that as gun regulation increases and gun laws increase, gun regulation meaning stuff like banning powerful weapons like automatic rifles, implementing a background check system, or requiring people to get permits and licenses before buying a gun, stuff like what I was advocating for, that when these are implemented, you see a decrease in the amount of violence in these countries, and you also see simultaneous decreases in both homicide rates generally, but then also substantially more significant decreases in actual gun-related crimes. So when Crowder says if you take them away, they decide to run a cooking show, well, no, Crowder, they don't decide to run a cooking show, but what they do is commit crimes at a less high rate because they don't have access to these massively powerful weapons that they were able to use to facilitate those crimes. So therefore, you end up having a net benefit to society. So no, I'm not saying we're going to solve resolve the issue 100%. I know that was just a little joke that you slipped in there because I wasn't going to be able to answer it and you can just pivot to the next topic. But regardless, it's still really blatantly wrong, because what we are doing and what you aren't doing, because you're simply ideologically driven, is seeking to try to find out what is going to be best for this country and what is going to most benefit the people of America. Okay, so then we get to the next point where he pivots to, which is going to be when I started discussing that mass shootings are often not stopped by the quote-unquote good guy with a gun, that often they result simply in people dying and then eventually the police are able to stop it, which he brings up later. He says like, oh, well, aren't you in favor of police having a gun? Which, yeah, obviously I'm in favor of law enforcement having access to guns. We're talking about the Second Amendment and citizens being able to bear arms. But basically, the point I was bringing up from the Mother Jones source that I'll link below is that very rarely are these mass shootings able to be stopped with a good guy with a gun. And so then in order to counteract this point, he went ahead and he brought up two different things. He first said that the number of defensive uses of handguns within the United States. He brought up that number and tried to say that because there was a substantial number of defensive uses of handguns within the United States, that some proportion of this would have led to the prevention of mass shootings. And then the second point he brought up, where he brought up the specific case of Stephen Woodworth, where he was able to stop a shooter using his AR-15. So we'll address both these points, but let's first go to where he brings up the defensive uses of handguns.
Before you ask how many people stop mass shootings, he did have that number. You know, it's hard to know exactly how many mass shootings are stopped, right?
Yeah.
Because we have an estimate, even if you look at the estimate according, I think, to the FBI and CDC, between 500,000 to 3 million defensive uses of firearms each year.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to measure because more often than not, the firearm is simply brandished and it stops a violent crime.
Yeah.
Right? So we don't know how many of those crimes stopped would be qualified as mass shootings.
And this is moving.
And I believe mass shooting is 3 or more, or it's 4 or more.
So first of all, this number isn't really being contextualized in any way with gun control. It's not saying, oh, well, if gun control is implemented, then we're going to see the number of defensive uses of handguns decreasing and the number of offensive uses of handguns staying stable. If he was able to show that, that would be counteracting my point. But simply stating the status quo and the number of defensive uses of handguns isn't really contextualizing it at all. And like the study I referenced earlier says, as you see gun regulation increase, you also see a corresponding decrease in the number of gun homicides being committed and homicides in general being committed. So that would argue against that point, which simply is stating what the status quo is. But even going further than that, if we look at a study done in November 2013 on the relationship between gun ownership and firearm homicide rates in the United States between 1981 and 2010, they found that in states with lower gun ownership rates, you had lower amounts of crimes being committed, showing that when people had less guns, less crimes were being committed within those states. So even if there were defensive uses of handguns, there was also less need for defensive uses of handguns. Therefore, there was less crime, as the study pointed out. But also, it found out that over 30 years of homicide data, that for every 1% increase in states' gun ownership rate, there is nearly a 1% increase in the firearm homicide rate. So that means more guns being owned led to more gun deaths happening within that state, which just seems A, logical, but B, is proven out within the studies. So this point that both him and also the student brought up, where they're like, oh, well, there's X number of defensive uses of handguns within America, therefore they're important, doesn't contextualize it and see what happens if we change that. What happens if we change the number of guns that people are able to get access to? What happens if we increase the amount of regulation? What happens if we decrease the amount of guns? And study after study bears out that implementing this and doing stuff that would lead to those results ends up making for a safer country. But so this was the point where I really thought that I might want to do this video, because what I did was I typed in the source that he linked for the defensive use of handguns. I am linked to a book called Priorities for Research to Reduce the Threat of Firearm-Related Violence. And so I go in this and I first quickly just type in defensive use of firearms and find the stat that Stephen was referencing. And then I start reading through the rest of the book. And this entire document that he links within his own video is a massive advocate for more gun regulation and contains multiple sources that completely counteract everything as Stephen is saying within this video. So when looking at Crowder's own source, it makes a case for why defensive use of guns is not a good argument against the fact that good guys with guns aren't often able to stop these situations. His own source says that even when defensive use of guns is effective in averting death or injury for the gun user in cases of crime, it is still possible that keeping a gun in the home or carrying a gun in public, concealed or open carry, may have a different net effect on the rate of injury. For example, if gun ownership raises the risk of suicide, homicide, or the use of weapons by those who invade the home of gun owners, this could cancel or outweigh the beneficial effects of defensive gun use. And that one recent study found that states with the most firearm legislation have a smaller number of firearm fatalities, and that an analysis of unintentional gun fatalities in 50 states revealed positive association between number of guns and number of fatalities, and that strong evidence also exists that observing a gun can prime aggressive behavior in certain situations, especially among those prone to aggression. So not only is the argument that defensive use of guns is somehow able to counteract the gun violence that's occurring within this country, not only is that fallacious because it's not looking at what would happen if we change the status quo and increase the number of gun regulations, but also within the own article that he sourced for this, it says that just using a gun defensively, it can cause a situation to turn violent and can increase the chance that fatalities will result out of that situation, completely counteracting the point he was trying to make originally. And it also says that, as I just read, that when we have number of guns increasing within a state, you have a correlated increase in the number of fatalities, and that as you have firearm legislation increase, you have a correlated decrease in the number of fatalities. So his own source completely argues against his point of defensive use of firearms, that he didn't even contextualize properly to argue against my study, saying that often these mass shootings aren't able to be stopped by guns. But no, this book goes further than that. Not only does it counteract his defensive use of firearm point, it goes on to validate and uphold my point that we should have more extensive background checks and look at indicators toward violence in order to stop these crimes from happening before they do. His own book that he cites within his video and doesn't let people click, maybe for this exact reason, says that violence prevention programs, legislative reforms, and declines in firearm availability may contribute to decreased firearm violence, and that some studies identify an association between increased firearm legislation, including firearm purchase background checks, and lower rates of fatal firearm violence. And so this is saying right there that when we change the status quo, when we increase the amount of gun legislation, and when we have violence prevention programs, and we look toward indicators for this violence and indicators that people should not own these extremely powerful weapons, that we see positive effects. And it even advocates that certain behaviors and characteristics associated with adolescence are positively correlated with increased risk for firearm violence, and it cites things such as antisocial behavior as indication that violence will occur in the future, and that's stuff that we can look toward in order to restrict gun access and therefore stop this violence from occurring and decrease the amount of gun violence happening within the United States. And then, he doesn't bring this up later in the video, but he tried to say that the US does not have one of the highest firearm-related homicide rates in the industrialized world.
I would argue that we have better gun rights laws than any other country. We're on the cutting edge of that.
And
but
then
the
I
point
would
is,
just look at the effect.
you go and you rattle off a few...
Because we have more gun deaths than any other country.
Facts. That's actually not true. That's
We
actually not
don't
true.
have more
We
gun
do not
deaths
have the
than-
most gun deaths of any country. No, that's actually not true.
Well,
We do
any
not have the highest...
Western developed country, I can add that caveat. I mean, like, obviously, I'm sure there's areas in, like, sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, why wouldn't we include them?
Why?
Are you saying because they're inferior?
No, because they're not developed, right? You have different levels of development and industrialization, right? You have like a war-torn...
Really fair.
And so, within his own book, it says that although violent crime rates have declined in recent years, the U.S. rate of firearm-related homicides is higher than any other industrialized country, 19.5 times higher. So, this book literally goes on to make counterpoints to things that Crowder says later within this video. So maybe he should read his own sources and then come back to the debate table with a little bit more of idea of what the facts are. So then the second point I mentioned earlier that he brings up is he brings up the specific example of Williford, who goes ahead and stops his shooting in Sutherland Springs with an AR-15.
Are you familiar with Sutherland Springs?
No.
Okay. That happened right here in Texas, not far from here, just in San Antonio. Are you
Yeah,
familiar with
I'm
that?
probably familiar with it, yeah, just not by the name.
Where the guy was shooting up a church, shot in his car, and the man stopped him with an AR-15. He was an NRA certified instructor.
It's a CNN article, I went to it. basically says that Williford was able to chase down the guy who ended up crashing into a stop sign. That Williford got on the car with his rifle propped up, told the guy to get out. The police arrived. Turned out that the guy had shot himself and killed himself within the vehicle before the police arrived there. It still does nothing to change the fact that we're talking about what would happen if we implemented this legislation. Would we see a decrease in the amount of violence, or would we see an increase because less people were able to defend themselves? And as the meta-analysis I talked about earlier that looked at 130 studies over 10 different countries, or any of the other studies I mentioned before that showed the increased legislation corresponded to decreased gun crime, show that this one-off example does nothing to combat the idea that we need more legislation within this country in order to try to solve the issue. And it's pretty disingenuous to go ahead and bring up these one-off examples in order to try to prove your point, because I could do the exact same thing. I could go grab headlines and say oh, there was a .45 caliber pistol that killed a child who shot himself when his parents weren't looking in the eye, and I'll cite all these examples below. Or an 8-month pregnant woman who accidentally was shot in the face by her 4-year-old son, or a father who was arrested after he accidentally shot his daughter in Glendale, or a Florida dad who accidentally shot his 14-year-old son. All of these horrible examples where, because people had access to a gun, a terrible accident occurred. Now, would I say that these one-off examples are endemic of a larger problem? Well, we'd have to look at studies for that, because unlike Crowder, I'm not going to cite one source and say that that's representative of an entire population of data. And then we get to the next big point, which is kind of a subsection under the background checks, where I was looking at indicators toward violence, where the big counterpoint that both Crowder and the student make toward this, or the second one, was that psychology is biased.
I think that psychologists being part of that process is critical, because we need to do something unless these gun deaths are going to continue within the United States.
I think a quick look at the polling of college professors and colleges in general would show that
I didn't say college professors. I just said professional psychologists.
Well, yeah, but college professors become
unless you're saying none exist, or you're somehow advocating that the field of psychology is partisan, then I don't think you have a point. Is the field of psychology partisan?
Yes, the field of psychology is
based on what?
It's based on polling, right? There's the least.
I mean, the 2 points to that would be one,
across the United States, the least partisan college field is business, of which liberal college professors outnumber conservative college professors by 4 to 1.
But that's because facts have a liberal bias. But when we're talking about actual professionals, we can have a bipartisan panel deciding this. And regardless,
Then you did say, you talked about psychologists.
Yes.
Okay. So you asked if psychology is partisan. Mm-hmm. And you don't believe that it is.
I would argue, sure, that academia has a left-leaning bias, but I don't think the study of psychology is partisan.
Well, because you said that facts have a liberal bias.
Yeah.
Come on, you were scoring points in there, and I think you were doing that to try and intimidate him a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's a line, right? Facts have a liberal bias, but the underlying idea behind that is just that the reason that academia is left-leaning is that the facts are lining up with that, and that's why people are taking that position.
I do. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know.
I do believe that psychology is politicized.
Therefore something, right? They never draw the conclusion for you within that statement. This is one of the big things when debating both of them. I noticed they never give you the impacts. They state something and then want you to draw the conclusion. Like with the defensive use of guns, they state that there is this many defensive use of guns, and then want you to then draw the conclusion that therefore we shouldn't restrict gun access. Why don't they draw this conclusion for you? Because they don't have the studies to back it up. When you look at the studies, it completely counteracts it. But that was just something I noticed. So he states psychology is biased. Doesn't tell you that therefore I guess the argument is that conservatives will have less access to guns, or that liberals will go power hungry and restrict everyone's access to guns based on this. I'm not sure what the argument was, but they said psychology is biased. And to try to prove this, the only substantive point that Crowder brings up, he tried to first say would you want an international or a national panel, and I have no idea what point he was trying to get at with this. I think he was just trying to eventually get us to talk about the DSM and transgenderism.
it is partisan. Let me ask you this: when you talk about a panel of psychologists, talking about just a national panel or an international committee of psychologists?
I mean, we're just talking about the United States here, right? Second Amendment. So
right, but you did point to the Australian gun buyback,
right?
And so you pointed to a
just
lot of
as an
international
example,
arguments.
it wouldn't be international because there is international governing bodies, but the U.S. doesn't really have to follow those by any. Like, we can pretty much do what we want, right? So
Right.
I'm more speaking
like the Second
national.
Amendment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when looking at the Second Amendment, we should see what works best.
So it should be only American psychologists. You know, whether there should be an international input committee on psychology.
Whichever one reduces crime the most.
But he brings that up, and I just basically said whatever works best. I really don't care. And so he brings up. We eventually get to the DSM-4 versus DSM-5.
Right. So that would be a good example. What's right, the DSM-4, the DSM-5? What would be correct?
The latest findings in psychology.
Okay.
This is where he took me completely off guard and pivots toward a topic that he seems to like to talk about a lot, which is gender dysphoria and transgender individualism. And I have no idea why he enjoys this topic so much, but for some reason he decided that was important to discuss within a gun control debate.
What would be the reason for gender dysphoria being changed to the latest one?
Hard pivot on the topic, but so
No, that's changed from the DSM-4 to DSM-5.
Gender dysphoria being put on the DSM, I think it was because it was just making a more nuanced point on what they took it off with gender dysphoria. Yeah,
I think, if I'm not mistaken, you can't call it gender dysphoria anymore.
Yeah,
I could be wrong. It does get to be confusing.
It's like I think it's making more nuanced points on mental illnesses. For example, they talk about like autism used to be a single diagnosis, and the Asperger's was a separate diagnosis in the DSM-4, and then they changed it in the 5 to be a spectrum, right? So it's autism spectrum disorder. So I think it's just they add layers of nuance on it and find out things like gender dysphoria were maybe misunderstood or not nuanced enough, so they move it into different categories in the new DSM.
So first of all, he completely misunderstood this, and I had only I heard that it had been changed, but I had not read in any level of depth how it had been changed. So I wasn't familiar with this, and for some reason he wasn't familiar with this, even though he was the one who brought it up. But basically what they did between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 was that they changed gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And gender identity disorder had basically historically been conflated with transgenderism, which is something that Crowder continually did throughout this debate.
Because two things you just did. You just referred to transgenders as mental illness. Is that how you would refer to it?
As transgenderism as a mental illness?
That's what you just said. Yeah, you said they were careful in discussing mental illness when I mentioned gender dysphoria.
Conflate the idea of someone being transgender and someone having a mental disorder, which is not the same thing at all. And that's what this change from the DSM-4 to DSM-5 really sought to clarify, was that you only are diagnosed with gender dysphoria to describe emotional distress over a marked incongruence between one's experience, expressed gender, and assigned gender. So it has to be interfering with your daily life and be amounting to something that's a serious mental illness. If it's simply if you simply have an incongruence between your experience and expressed gender, but this isn't causing you to not be able to function, then it's not considered a disorder, right? That's how we diagnose mental disorders. But this wasn't a distinction that Crowder was able to make, and since I hadn't really read in depth on this subject before talking to him, and he didn't provide any proper information on it, we weren't really able to get that clarification. But that's basically what they did. And so he said that because they did this, that was somehow an indication that psychology was biased. But this is just a dumb argument, because they changed categories in order to clarify how the diagnostic criterion should be used constantly. Like I brought up between autism spectrum disorder and Asperger's and autism in the DSM-4 was changed simply because it's a better technique of diagnosing it on a spectrum, and they were able to see better clinical results, I guess, or however they're evaluating that. Same with this. They were able to see that, we're going to further clarify that this is only a disorder if it's dramatically impacting your ability to function within daily life, if it is causing emotional distress, right? So he just simply misunderstood this, but he was trying to get to this point because he wanted me to say that it was a serious mental disorder to be transgender, which is just wrong. But he wanted me to get to that point because he wanted to then cite the transgender suicide rate to say that it's a 42% suicide rate. And because of this, since you're saying that the guns are going to increase suicide, or that we should look toward indicators of violence, because you're saying that, therefore, you'd be in favor of restricting gun access to transgender individuals, right?
psychology partisan.
Yeah.
So a transgender at the time of the DSM-4 can't purchase a firearm by your logic. Now they can.
No, because I never said everyone in the DSM can't purchase a firearm.
Let's say that back then it was considered a mental illness, was considered very severe mental illness.
I said psychologists should look at indicators for violence. Transgenderism in the DSM-4 isn't an indicator for violence. It was an indicator.
Sure it is.
In the DSM-4, it said that people...
42% attempted suicide rate. It's the biggest indicator you could possibly have of any demographic of people. Transgender suicide rate.
Yeah, then I would argue that you shouldn't have access to a handgun, because that's what's most used in suicides.
Well, yeah, I would be in favor of restricting it to people who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria and are having this marked emotional distress if they have a 42% attempted suicide rate. Because why wouldn't we want to try to stop these people from committing suicide? And why wouldn't we want to be able to try to give them the chance to get proper medical care in order to resolve these issues and proper psychological care? Like, what argument would you make counter to that? That we should be giving them higher access to guns so that they can off themselves? That's just horrible. And like I said later in the video, I think that overall decreasing it across the board, regardless of whether or not you're a transgender individual or not, would decrease the rate of suicides, because like the study I talked about, simply access to a handgun dramatically increases your chance of actually going through and committing suicide, committing suicide.
When we're talking about handguns specifically, when people have access to handguns, they're much more likely to commit suicide just by getting access to that handgun than someone without it who probably wouldn't go through with it.
The specific study I was citing is from Harvard, cited 12 or more U.S. case-controlled studies, and within every study of examination, they found that access to firearms is associated with an increased suicide risk. And I'll, again, cite that below. So his only real point against the study that I brought up, that having access to handguns or access to firearms increases the rates of suicide, is he says, well, then you would think that we would have higher rates of suicide than gun control countries, right?
If that were the case, you'd think the United States would have an
I would argue transgender.
You would think that the United States has an abnormally high suicide rate. Do they?
I don't know it versus other.
No, they don't.
countries. Okay.
Not compared to gun control countries. But again, my point here is you said psychology is not partisan, but it is.
And he then kind of railroaded me past this point and said, like, well, we don't. They actually have higher rates in, like, Japan and Scandinavia, and then continued talking and changed the topic before I was able to respond. But really, this idea that different countries that may have more gun regulation or less guns than the United States have higher suicide rates in certain instances has nothing to do with whether or not decreasing the amount of guns in a country decreases the amount of suicides, right? Because, again, it's doing the same thing he did with the defensive use of guns, where he's looking just at the status quo. He's not looking at what happens when we change the status quo, or what happens when we do these case-controlled studies in similar regions and see what happens when we implement certain policies and how that affects things. So let's take Japan. So Japan has a substantially different culture than the United States. There's much different social pressures, and that these lead to much higher rates of suicide within Japan, much higher rates of like stress and anxiety and like workplace displeasure within Japan, right? And so when we're comparing an extremely regulated country like Japan to the United States, what he would have had to show to prove this point is say, well, Japan took away some of its gun regulation and had more guns within the country, and they actually saw a decrease in suicides, or they saw suicides stay constant. So we know that these gun regulations are not impacting the suicide rate, or these gun regulations I don't know if he would argue they negatively impact, but let's just say they are not impacting the suicide rate. But he doesn't do this. He simply just cites what they are currently, says they're higher than the United States. So let's go ahead and take the study that I sourced, which is within the United States, 12 or more case-controlled studies that the Harvard article cites, that shows that increased access to firearms is associated with increased suicide rates. Now, if we take that same model and apply it to Japan, which we can't necessarily do, but let's just say because Crowder wants to compare us to that country, let's say we did, that would argue that if we took away the regulations that they have within Japan, because they have such a higher suicide rate already, that would just increase exponentially, and we would see more suicides occurring within Japan because they have access to weapons that they're able to facilitate these easier with. So this argument just doesn't at all impact what we were talking about with suicide rates. It was just like a side point that he used to quickly pivot, and then before I was able to point out the logical fallacies within what he was saying or how it doesn't interact with the argument at all, immediately changed topic to the next point. So finally we get down to the last filibuster that Crowder starts, and really I was only able to interrupt once when I said that we have more gun-related deaths than any other country, and immediately Crowder jumps on this because he knows the dialogue tree that he'll typically go down with a college student and have them buy wholesale. Well, he'll say, oh, well, we actually don't have any higher gun-related deaths than any other country, and then he puts his little source at the bottom. But what he fails to mention is that, and that I pointed out, is that we have to add on the caveat Western developed country, or as his own source says, industrialized country, which the US is 19.5 times higher than. Why would we make this distinction? Is it because I think that we're superior to these other countries, as Crowder slyly tries to sneak in because he needs to get a gotcha moment for his audience? No, it's because we are comparing ourselves to comparable nations when we're looking at what policy we should implement so that we can see how the policy is actually going to function within that country. We're not going to compare ourselves to a war-torn region or a region that's still developing, because that's not going to tell us how it's going to work in the US. It's going to tell us how it's going to work in the US 100 years ago. So it's just a really disingenuous initially point, and then simply just trying to get you a gotcha moment at the end point. So the final point that he makes here is wrong on so many levels.
As far as mass shootings, I think last time they ran the numbers, Norway and France were higher as far as mass shootings. As far as suicide, actually, a lot of these Scandinavian countries and Japan have higher suicide rates. Again, you could go through and go kind of assume that I'm wrong and fact check me on all of this.
He talks about Norway and France having higher mass shootings, and like Scandinavian countries in general, than some Scandinavian countries than the United States. Because one, the source that he cites, and I'll link below a larger article discussing exactly what's statistically wrong with this, because it's a lot, but basically it has an outsized statistical effect where it's able to inflate the amount of deaths occurring due to mass shootings within certain countries that have them extremely rarely, simply because of the small amount of people within those countries. So comparatively, it makes it seem like it's larger than the United States, even though it's actually much, much, much smaller than the US's versus the US's population, which is much larger. And so if you look at a proper study done on this, a cross-national study of 171 countries in 2016 found that the United States had far more mass shooters, 90 shooters in 46 years, or 31% of the total, than the other countries, which averaged 1.7 public mass shooters per country. So when we're actually looking at the data, no, this last point is completely wrong. Not only is it completely wrong, it has nothing to do with what I just said of the US having more gun deaths than any other country, and it also does nothing to argue against the idea of having more gun regulation, because it doesn't say that if these countries implemented gun regulation or took away gun regulation that there was some change in the number of mass shootings. He's simply stating what the number is, again, the status quo, which is the only evidence that either of them brought up throughout this entire debate. The only point I didn't get to bring up during the debate that I would have liked to was talking about maybe a little bit more about universal background checks. We got really bogged down in the looking at indicators for violence and didn't get really talk about proposals such as closing different loopholes that allow private transactions to occur without background checks having occurred within them. And actually about 80% of firearms acquired for criminal purposes are obtained through private party transfers that don't involve these background checks that might have been able to stop them in the first place. But hey, maybe if Crowder decides that he'll eventually answer my email and have me on the show, then we can talk about these statistics and see what arguments he would have against some what I think are extremely reasonable measures that are currently being pushed by the DNC in order to try to do something about gun violence within this country.
You could go through and go kind of assume that I'm wrong and fact check me on all of this. But